Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us today for our annual regulatory event. We appreciate you being here. Hopefully you helped yourself to some lunch. If you haven't, please do. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that we will be hosting a Q&A panel at the end. So if you do have any questions, just take note of them and we'll give you the opportunity to ask your questions at the end. Also, for those of you on the webinar, you can either jot down your questions or you can enter them into the chat feature. So we can pick up your questions there and we can read them out loud at the end for you as well. All right. So before we get started, one last thing. If you need to use the restroom at all during the presentations or if you want to grab some more lunch, help yourself. Don't feel shy, okay? Bathrooms are just down the hall and on the right. Otherwise, I think we are ready to begin. So first up, we have Steve Ernst. Steve is a Senior Project Manager 3 here at PACE. He's a part of our regulatory consulting team. Actually, he leads our regulatory consulting team. Steve has been with us since 2011. He's a technical expert for REACH, Canadian WMIS, DSL, TSCA, OSHA, DOT, FIFRA, and really many more regulations, both domestic and international. Steve has been in the industry for nearly 30 years and holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Iowa. Welcome, Steve.
Well, good morning and thank you for coming in. This morning, one of the first things we're going to talk about is what changes and when OSHA updates the hazard communication standard. As many of us probably know and have experienced over the last few years, we're currently under revision 3 and OSHA is proposing now to go to revision 7 of the GHS. So a little bit of background on hazard communication. We'll keep it real brief. The Right to Know Act, 1983, United States federal government established OSHA, the hazard communication standard, which essentially says that companies which produce and use hazardous materials have to inform their employees about the hazards of those materials. They have to provide specific pieces of information, usually in the form of safety data sheets and labels, but also training on how to read those as well in the standard. In March of 2012, OSHA accepted a final rule which changed the hazard communication standard, which had been established in 1983, to accept the GHS version of classifications into the hazard communication standard. At that time, the revision of the US UNGH model was revision 3. As you'll see, that's changed quite a bit over the few intervening years. So, briefly, what is the GHS? Just because we adopted it into our regulation doesn't mean it's the entirety of the regulation, but it's a really important part of it. It provides a common and consistent criteria to define and classify chemical hazards. The common and consistent is the really important part, where we're using the same criteria to define a hazard as a neighboring country or the same guy down the street. We all have the same criteria. The GHS also provides, identifies the intrinsic hazards, which we really kind of had a loose system for previously, very specifically, and it provides uniform standards of phrases and pictograms to represent those hazards, which we did not have before either. Really interesting and unique part about the GHS is because it's a model regulation promulgated by the United Nations. It provides a unique underlying infrastructure for a lot of countries who want to get into and protect their employees. So they can adopt the UN GHS standard model regulation ad hoc into entirety and have an entire system almost ready to go. They don't have to go into a lot of rule making and things like that, which we had gone through when we originally did this. So that's really unique and helpful. And as part of their joining the UN, it actually becomes part of their requirements to do things like this. Now, the GHS is not legally binding in and of itself. It is always incorporated into another regulation in those particular countries. Countries are allowed to, and the regulatory agencies are allowed to choose all or some of the parts of the GHS. We call that choosing the building blocks. But if you choose a building block, it will be essentially the same between countries anywhere in the world. So if we adopted acute tox 1, the criteria for acute tox 1 is the same here as it is in the European Union. However, we can choose not to take a particular part of that regulation, like acute tox 5, which is the least hazardous materials, we didn't adopt that building block, other countries did. So it allows a lot of flexibility for incoming countries to tailor their hazard communication system to what they already had in place without completely overwriting it. Overall, now we have some roughly 72 countries worldwide that have adopted some form of the GHS. UN Committee of Experts, which includes the expert on transportation dangerous goods, which all this started from, they update the UN model regulation every 2 years to try to stay current, keep improving the thing, make it better in a living document. But that leaves us to a situation here, if we look at the map of the world, we have everything from revision 2 to revision 7 across the world. In the United States, we adopted revision 3. We're only in compliance with Australia, who's also in the process of updating to revision 7. We've got one country in revision 2, although they accept anybody else's GHS. The European Union is revision 7. They stay the most current with everything else, all being that the UN is right in their backyard. So what it leads to is a mix match of what adoption or what building blocks every country's adopted and the specifics that are in the GHS itself. So we adopted things called the endpoints that are explained in the Purple Book. It establishes the hazard classification criteria. You can see we originally started this in 2003 with the United Nations. By the time we adopted it, 2009, it was the 3rd revision. By the time it went into full effect in 2015, we were already 3 revisions behind where the UN was. So time marches on, the UN keeps putting out their revisions. OSHA tries to keep up with these revisions. The Directorate of Standards and Guidance has been working on updating the GHS since they published it in 2015. They started it the next year, and since then have never managed to quite catch up. About the time they get ready to adopt it, a new version comes out and they go, ooh, something shiny and new, and they want to look at that. So it always has kept rolling over. Now, last year, the White House said, you need to really get on top of this, and we want you to be update your hazard communication standard. And OSHA responded by saying, well, we're going to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking in March next year, this year, 2019. That actually never came out, and it's never come out since. However, I spoke with OSHA all the way along this route, including this morning even, and they still indicate that they're going to enact revision 7 as soon as they get it all finalized. Maybe. We don't know. They're looking at revision 8, and now they're really excited about that too. So what does that mean for us? Well, this is a graphical representation of what we adopted under revision 3. It's the physical hazards, the health hazards, the environmental hazards, and some other stuff that we thought was really, really important. So hazards not otherwise classified, things like combustible dust, which don't exist in the GHS, we made a special exception for. We didn't adopt environmental hazards because that's actually under EPA, but we did adopt all these health hazards. Things in red are items that we adopted only parts of. So you'll see some of this come up later on when we see some of the other revisions. So if we jump to revision 7 from revision 3, what's that going to look like for those of us that have authored all these SDSs and have them out of the marketplace under revision 3? It means we have to adopt all the revisions that went in between 7 and 3, 4, 5, and 6 as well. So what does that mean? Well, very specifically, it means there's going to be, from revision 4, new hazard categories for chemically unstable gases and non-flammable aerosols. So one of the major changes that you see from revision 3 to revision 4 and all the way through this is this non-flammable aerosols. Under the previous revision that we're under, revision 3, non-flammable aerosols are a compressed gas and carry a specific hazard statement and a pictogram. We're going to now move that to a non-flammable aerosols, which does not have that information. So actually it saves you a lot of label space. Furthermore, revision 3, 4 went on to say there's further classification criteria, precautionary statements. They changed 12 P phrases in the first revision from the second. So they replaced P281 with 280, for example. Not a major change. None of these things are major changes. However, if you're an SDS author or if you have a lot of SDSs and you have an automated system, it's going to create inconsistencies. Revision 5, they added some new test methods, clarification of hazard criteria. You'll see that a lot. Basically, they're explaining things better. They revised the classification labeling summary tables, nice new tables for things. And they added a designation for pictograms, which is really important for those of us who have automated systems because it allows us to keep track of pictograms electronically. But you'll also see this on some of your SDSs that's all the list is this little nomenclature number down the GH01 for explosives, for example. Revision 6 added a hazard category for pyrophoric gases and desensitized explosives. That's a really fun one. I'd love to use that one, but in 6 years of doing safety data sheets, I've actually never had the opportunity to use that one. So they added some new ones that are very rare, but they felt needed to be pulled out as special examples. Again, clarification of the criteria for hazard classes, additional information in section 9. So they added some more definitions of what they wanted. They added a few more criteria, particle size being one example of one. And they further revised and rationalized the precautionary statements. Anytime you see the word rationalized in their presentation, it means they changed the P phrases in your safety data sheet. It's not going to match the revision 3 anymore. And they added a 50 new example of Annex 7 labeling for small packages. We run into this a lot in the US marketplace where very, very small samples, for example, labs are going to industry labs. They're very small package sizes and they're like they have to apply the GHS labels, but how do you put it on, for example, a bottle this size where it's 20 millimeters long? So they give us a really good example of exactly what they want and how we then label the full information on the box. Revision 7, which we're looking at going into, further clarification of the hazard criteria, more criteria for flammable gases. They'll updated the pyrophoric gases will be in the flammable gas category. They added a couple of new precautionary statements for some explosives and a new example for fold-out labels for small package sizes again. So again, small package sizes became a really important issue for OSHA. And they've really done a good job of giving us some pictograms. So what does this all mean for us? They did a lot of updates to help us do our job better when we're doing safety data sheets. This changing of a non-flammable aerosol classification means the pictogram goes away, which is really helpful for a lot of people for space. We have some new hazard categories for desensitized explosives, some rare ones. But there's likely the biggest change is going to be the change to the precautionary phrases is going to change what your SDSs look like from previous versions to the new version. There'll be some changes in section 9 as well, although most of those have not been required. Regarding the changes for P phrases, you can use the new phrases now. I did actually confirm that this morning from OSHA that if you want to go ahead and use revision 7, go ahead. They're not enforcing that. It's fine. But it will change how your SDSs look if you print them under version 3. So the big question we get is, am I going to have to revise all those SDSs I worked so hard to make? And really, probably not. It's the biggest issue is going to be the rationalization of those precautionary phrases to align with the new versions of the GHS. It may require you to change how your labels and SDSs look. Most of the changes are by definitions, and relatively few classifications are added for really rare classifications. The really big exception is if you have a lot of non-flammable aerosols, this will be great for you. Now, so when we did this is real simple from the original 2011 HAZCOM to what we did under GHS. The first change we had, SDS changes. We had 16 section SDS was required, mandatory headings and subheadings, mandatory P phrases and H phrases. Label elements all became required. Now we don't. We just have very minor changes. So why should you consider updating your SDSs? Well, basically, these revisions are going to cause inconsistencies in automated systems. We don't know what OSHA is actually going to put out. GHS is just part of the HAZCOM. They could actually revise some more things, so we want to stay tuned to that. But more importantly, we're adding things now that also have state regulations, updates to Cal Prop 65. New York had a Cleaners Act that went into effect and then was revoked by law. So those things are all changing. It's going to come back. And most importantly, EPA is now directing changes. If you do a new substance in the United States, EPA can actually mandate changes to your safety data sheet, and that includes to your P phrases as well. We've seen it. So you need to be aware of that and make sure your information is up to date for your substances. So it's going to be a fun time when they actually enact all of that. I think I actually made time. Sorry if I went quick.
All right, thank you, Steve. So if you do have any questions regarding OSHA, we'll cover that at the end. Once again, just jot them down, we'll come back to it. So next up, we have Dennis Lee. He'll be talking about PFAS. He's actually our resident PFAS expert, so it should be a special treat. Dennis is the Senior General Manager of PACE's North and West region of the Environmental Division. He has been in the industry for over 25 years, and he brings a lot of expertise. So let's welcome Dennis.
All right. Hear me okay back there?
Yeah.
Perfect. I get to be the first person to say good afternoon. Real quick show of hands. Who here has more than just a passing knowledge of PFAS? Good. Then my presentation is at the right level. I'm not even going to ask my follow-up question because I was going to ask how many have actively searched for it or tested for it. And based off of that, I would say not very many. So PFAS. PFAS is PFAS, which is poly and perfluoroalkyl substances. So these guys are carbon and fluorine long chain or fairly long chain hydrocarbons that are extremely stable. They're anthropogenic, so these are something that we created, we invented. They may have fully fluorinated carbons, which are per, or they may have some of the fluorine substituted by hydrogen, which is poly. It's all the chemistry you get today. Historical uses. So these guys have been around since the 40s. Started out as non-stick coatings. Really quickly realized that if you can keep an egg from sticking to a pan, you might be able to keep mud from sticking to your carpet. So they went into things like stain-resistant carpet, stain-resistant fabrics. One of the most important and life-saving uses of this is firefighting foam. So it's something that you can mix with water and throw it on a fuel fire, and it will actually coat the top, remove the oxygen, kill the fire. That same property then got used in metal plating. So where you've got a lot of acid vapor coming up in your process and you're trying to protect your workers' health, you can throw it's AFFF, aqueous firefighting foam, on the top of the bats, and it will keep the vapors from coming up. It's used for protective coatings. It kind of is the miracle compound. You have Gore-Tex, if you've got any type of water resistant, stain resistant equipment, it's used in it. It was used in packaging to keep it from sticking to food. So when we went to paper to be more environmentally friendly from styrofoam, you put PFAS on the inside of the paper. It keeps the paper from degrading with the contact for the moisture of the food. It's in microwave popcorn bags. So another one where if you throw in hot butter into a paper product, it's going to be a mess unless you have a barrier. The barrier is PFAS. So why are we going to talk about it? Because everybody is. I pulled this up before a presentation earlier this year. All I did was type in PFAS on a web search. These were all under 24 hours old, and they're all different. And it was Bing. This was not Google. So that tells you that this is a big deal. You know, finding it in wells. People are testing at the state level. Drinking water standards being proposed. Apparently, 4 pension fund administrators committed major infractions. Now, we don't test for pension fund administrators, but I thought that was kind of funny. So it's a big deal. And by the way, when you come back from this, don't tell your boss to do a Google alert for this, because you'll get an email every hour saying, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? So this made me feel pretty wise. This is a quote from me. Little self-plug here. Water Waste Digest, October 2010. These compounds tend to dissolve easily in water do not evaporate at normal room temperatures and pressures. Any potential side effects on human health are poorly understood. They've been detected in wastewater treatment plant effluent, surface water, and groundwater, as well as drinking water. Conventional water treatment systems are not specifically engineered or equipped to remove these compounds, and their removal efficacy is largely unknown. Am I ahead of my time? It was 9 years ago. Nope. I was talking about pharmaceuticals in drinking water. Once again, very useful compounds, widely used. They go through the body and are not completely used up. They go into treatment and they end up in our groundwater and our drinking water. EPA tested for them. They were there. They were everywhere. But nothing really happened. It just, yeah, it's there. We know it's there, but we don't really understand the toxicological effects. Just kind of went away. It was actually kind of a news cycle. So one of the big debates in this industry is that what's going to happen to PFAS? So is this deja vu all over again? Once again, a very useful and oftentimes life-saving product that's out there. In both cases, they ran through the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, UCMR, which is what EPA uses to look for the next compounds to regulate in drinking water. And if they do regulate a compound in drinking water, then everything cascades from that. So once it's an issue in drinking water, then you got to protect non-drinking water, groundwater, surface water, soils, everything else. Just like PHACs, there's been a media scare. I mean, this news cycle has been longer and louder than even the pharmaceutical. There is very limited toxicological data, and the data that's out there is on 2 compounds out of a class of about 4,000. And those 2 are still open to debate. They are unregulated by the federal government, and there's really no consistency on how people are approaching this. That's why I call it uncharted waters. So why might this end up being different than pharmaceutically active compounds? You know, why would an unregulated contaminant have staying power? Why would states adopt regulations ahead of the EPA? Something that really truly is in the fabric of our society, are we going to completely try to kill it? And, you know, for some of you, is an unmonitored, unregulated contaminant, is it going to create a liability for you? I have a theory that there's a reason why this is different. This hit the news cycle at the same time as this. And I think this changed the way states looked at potential contamination. So one of the leaders in PFAS regulation is Michigan, and I don't think that's an accident. And I can tell you that when Michigan jumps in, California wasn't going to be far behind. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, now Wisconsin's moving into it. So it is it looks like it's got a lot of staying power because of what happened in Flint. Even though that was lead, that was a big deal. So where are we now? The EPA has put out a multi-agency, multidisciplinary action plan that's going to last for several years. I can say that I have high confidence they will regulate PFOA and PFOS in drinking water with an MCL. But it could also fall under that's Safe Drinking Water Act, could also fall under RCRA, CERCLA, the Clean Water Act, EPCRA. It really could end up everywhere, which since it is everywhere, it's going to be a regulatory nightmare. So far, we have 22 actions that have been implemented already related to PFAS. Sometimes it's funding for testing, sometimes it's funding for toxicology. Some of them, they're actually setting MCLs in drinking water and effluent regulations. There are 63 more that are proposed right now. This is why in 15 minutes, I'm not trying to tell you every single state, because while I'm talking, some state legislature probably just passed something. So it happens so quick and so fast, it's just been crazy. This has been bounced around, strict product liability. So if there does turn out to be some health effects, anyone who was in the manufacture, transport, or use of a product can be held liable based off of their ability to pay. That's got a lot of people's attention. In fact, I just saw on the plane last week a commercial for a class action suit for people who have cancer that have used firefighting foam. And then a race to zero. The states right now are going to the point where they're kind of seeming like they're one-upping each other a little bit and lowering the levels to the point that if you want to get a clean sample, you cannot apply makeup, you cannot wear a piece of clothing that is new and unwashed, you cannot use fabric softener in the clothing that you are wearing, you cannot eat fast food or packaged food within 24 hours if you want to be sure that you're going to get a clean sample. That's how low we're looking. Single digit part per trillion. Basically, twice the level. If Neil Armstrong chucked a dime on the way to the moon, that's 14 parts per trillion. We're looking at 7 down to 2. So this right here, instead of giving you all of the detail, this is a great site, and I assume people will be able to access this. These guys keep on top of every regulation as it comes out, fairly real time. Within a week, they're adding it, and it is changing a lot. So what now? I know I just threw a lot at you in 15 minutes. I was on a panel last week that was 4 hours long on PFAS, and you just got it in 15 minutes. So it's worthwhile evaluating the potential liability. Do you have these products? Have you used them? Where did you use them? Did they leave the property through wastewater? Did they leave it through being on the ground and rainwater? Educate your internal stakeholders. Don't let them get blindsided. You've got to have multiple disciplines. This is not something to go solo. That one's real important. Legal. Get them involved. They may want anything you do. If you really think you have a liability, they might want it to be attorney-client work product. Technical, environmental, regulatory, health and safety. And then don't just go in willy-nilly. What are you looking for? Why are you looking? What do you expect the outcome to be? What are your actions going to be based off of potential outcomes? If you do get to the point that you test, I'm just going to breeze over this. There's a bunch of methods. They don't all do the same thing. So you really got to understand those goals, what you're trying to accomplish. What analytes are you looking for? There's a ton of different lists. Different states are regulating different compounds. What are the potential issues with the matrices that you need to sample? Field blanks, if you're going to sample it, you got to have field blanks, because if you stop at McDonald's and got the #2 value meal, you very well could be contaminating your sample. Time considerations, it's not our normal analytical, so it takes a longer time, so you really need to plan for a longer time to get the data back. And then also understanding the drivers and communicating that with your partners. Why are you doing it? Is it for a regulation? If it is for a regulation, did you get a letter? Did they explain specifically what you need to be doing? Because if you don't, there's so many varieties out there, you may get something that doesn't do what you need. And I think that's my time.
All right, thank you, Dennis. All right, next we are welcoming Casey Kapuzman. Casey is a client services manager 3 here at PACE, and he's been with us for nearly 6 years. He manages a team of regulatory specialists that are solely responsible for the collection, validation, and entering of raw material data from one of our large clients. So this is sort of his area of expertise.
Thank you, April. So when we talk about companies, one of the metaphors that often comes up is this idea of a ship, right? You're steering the ship, you're riding the ship. So I kind of want to stick on that metaphor for just a second and go along with the idea of the sea of information that's out there. And when you're on this sea of information, you run into these icebergs. And the thing about icebergs, as we all know, is that 90% of the mass is below the surface. So what we're seeing on a surface level many times at a company is information that the customers need. So the information that they want to know and the parts we'll put out for them. Or the information that maybe the higher ups at a company need, you know, the registrations or the dossiers of a particular product. Not really considering how much data and how much parsing through regulation goes into just getting those bits of information that are at the surface level. And all of that together makes it a huge undertaking just to get those little bits of information that are above the surface level. It makes steering that ship through stormy waters a little difficult. So when we talk about data, data is everything. Whether you hate it or love it, you need it. It runs our world as we know it. You need it for regulations as well as simple company functioning. And it's not just the regulations that are driving the big push right now. Customers are also driving it, whether it's knowing exactly where it's sourced from to finally drilling down to what's in a material. They all want to know it, and they want it readily available and readily accessible. And so tracking down that information isn't the tough part. It's also just maintaining it. So trying to get information from vendors can be difficult because the buy-offs and sellouts, the composition changes to just simple turnover at a vendor location all make maintaining regulatory data difficult, if not almost impossible. And so kind of getting into those regulations that we talk about where there's a big mass, one of the regulations that requires a ton of information was REACH. And REACH, the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals, came into effect January 1st, 2007. And as many of us know, it wasn't just brought in full bore, it was phased in. And it was phased in over a number of years, with the most recent one being May of 2018. And with the phase in of 2018, anything that was as low as 1 metric ton had to be registered. And if that sounds like a low threshold, it's because it is. I mean, I'm pretty sure my kids need a metric ton of sanitizer just to stay clean. So it's not a high standard. So you know that your materials are registered. But what about the vendors? Are their materials registered? Are they properly classified? Do they have any SVHCs in them? Does the vendor confirm that they have SVHCs in them? Is the vendor keeping up with the semi-annual updates that come out for SVHCs? Are they aware of the semi-annual updates for SVHCs? If they're using EC numbers, are they aware of the corresponding CAS numbers? Because one EC number can go to multiple CAS numbers, and one CAS number can go to more than one EC number. It's a lot of information. As we all know, vendors are not always the most well-informed and the most helpful to get that information out to us. And part of collecting the data isn't just collecting it, it sometimes is educating those vendors, because a lack of compliance isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's a large part just due to lack of knowledge or lack of resources to keep compliant. Another one that requires a ton of information is RoHS. I'm going to pronounce it RoHS. I've heard RoHS, I've heard RoHS, I'm going to say RoHS. So it's the Restriction of Hazardous Substance Directive. And this came into effect in 2003 and full bore in 2006. And in 2006 is when all electronic products had to be compliant in the appropriate markets. And originally it had 6 materials on it. And those 6 materials are cadmium, lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, polybrominated biphenyls, and polybromated diphenyl ethers. But, as of July 22nd, 2019, 4 more substances were added, and they're all phthalates. And these phthalates are expensive to test for. So the previous 6 substances, they're all heavy metals, and to test for just 4 of those, it was $325. We got a quote from a lab. In comparison, to test for these 4 phthalates, it was $370 to start, plus $200 per phthalate. That's $1,170 for just one material. So having a dedicated group who's knowledgeable in the regulations to contact vendors is far more economical and far more efficient. And I'd also like to point out that all 4 of those are on REACH as well. And this was first proposed, thrown out in 2015. So if the materials you have are before 2015, or the information you have, sorry, is before 2015, are you still in compliance? Are they aware that you're still in compliance? And even the thing is, it came in July 22nd, 2019. We all know there's plenty of vendors who wait until that last minute to do it. Even at the beginning of this year, are you still compliant? Do they include those phthalates? So it's something that as a company, as a group, you have to be concerned about what risks you're willing to take and decide that and make a business decision based on it, but it's something to keep in mind. And part of you might be saying, well, I don't sell to the EU. Okay, but some of the states have adopted, if not RoHS itself, they've adopted the exact same materials and the exact same limits. California, New Jersey, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, New York, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin are all states that have some version, some form, some regulation exactly similar to RoHS. And on top of that, there's other countries that have done it as well. China, Japan, and Korea all have some version of RoHS with similar, if not the exact same limits on it. So are you still compliant? Are your vendors still compliant? Again, it gets back to asking this question. So all this to say that this is what my teams do on a regular basis. So RDM is raw material data management. And the objective is not only to obtain, but maintain that raw material data. So we take the data, we input into the appropriate database, and we parse through it for regulatory accuracy and consistency. And we also maintain it by comparing it to previous information, make sure that's still consistent and that nothing has changed. And if it has, we raise the flag if need be. So one example where we've done this very situation of going through it is with this RoHS situation, kind of like we were talking about with the July 22nd. So we were looking at a team member on one of my teams noticed that the change to RoHS was coming. So what we did is we got together a plan and we brought to the client, got a little flow chart right there, just a really rough draft of it. And we kind of explained what we thought was a good way to go about it, which included to do a gap analysis. So we would run through their entire database, double check what they had listing it as RoHS and what had those documents in them, or I'm sorry, those phthalates in the composition, and do a gap analysis on it. From there, we'd be able to weed out the ones that are good to go. We know it's fine. We'd be able to know the ones that maybe they raised a concern, but there was a risk to be accepted, and then ones that we knew we had to go back and get the data. So it allowed us to be proactive and get it and start getting it as soon as we realistically could. One other one we had was with REACH and RoHS. So we had 2 companies who they want REACH and RoHS product line compliance. And they both manufacture intermediates and they use those in large assemblies that are going to be sold to the EU. So what we did is we broke down every part into their components. And they wanted to do it this way because of the high cost of it. Like we said, that $1,170 earlier, right? So we broke down the components and we started looking for them through the lens of if they were compliant or not, and gave them a red light or a green light. And because the way this was set up, it would carry through the whole product. And if it was red light, it would flag on the far end of the final product. And then unless it could be shown, obviously, that that was below the limits necessary to be compliant with it. And then they could do searches based off of the programs we were doing to see what flagged and what didn't. And one of those programs was a complex Excel spreadsheet. And the other was a fully enterprise management software system. And again, we talked about the expense. This project had several hundred materials on it. Still does. And so imagine $170 for hundreds of materials. And again, it gets back to how efficient and economical it is to use a team dedicated to finding out this information and parsing through it that way. So all this to show the benefit of having a raw material data team. And having a team dedicated to this, you, again, are able to allow them to file through and get the information without having to test it directly. And if you want to include a team like this, you need to have them in the discussions, and you need to have them in the discussions early, because you need to factor in their timeline. I think there's a tendency for us to think that turnaround time to get information back or the cooperation of the vendors is a lot easier than it realistically is. All of that needs to be taken into account, and the timeline that the RDM sets out is going to go further for being on time, as well as fewer overshoots and fewer issues in meeting what you need to meet to be compliant. So the real takeaway message is to really have a dedicated team to raw material data management. They can track REACH registrations, SVHC tracking anticipation, composition changes, ROSE tracking, and anticipation of ROSE updates. There's talk right now of a ROSE 4 coming out with 7 more materials on it. Nothing solid yet, but it's coming down the pipeline. So again, having the RDM team there goes a long way for you being ready. It doesn't have to be in REACH or ROSE. It can be for anything, but having a dedicated team to those raw material areas goes a long way.
All right, thank you, Casey. One more presentation this afternoon before we let you all go. We have Steve joining us again. Steve has already spoke with us, but he's going to be talking about the 2020 chemical data reporting. Very much a hot topic right now, so this should be pretty informative for all of us.
All right, thank you, and thank you for hanging with us through lunch here. And all right, 2020, the TSCA Chemical Data Reporting Rule. So what are we looking at that's coming up? New regulations coming down the pipe. One of them that's actually a reoccurring regulation that we see every 4 years is the TSCA Chemical Data Reporting Rule. While it's not unique, we've seen it before, there are a number of really significant changes that have happened to the actual Toxic Substances Control Act in the last few years, which are going to make this chemical data reporting rule unique, to say the least. So chemical data reporting rule, the background is when EPA promulgated the Toxic Substances Control Act in 1977, under Section 8, they were guided to, quote, to compile and keep current an inventory of chemical substances in commerce in the United States. This has been called the TSCA inventory. What we know we have to be compliant with, we have to have our CAS numbers on that list in order for them to be sold legally in the United States commerce. Every 4 years, EPA has mandated that domestic manufacturers and importers of chemicals must report to the EPA under the Chemical Data Reporting Rule. This is the keep current part of the TSCA inventory. This is how EPA goes and looks and sees what uses are you doing. Are there new uses, new hazards, new chemicals that are not on the list, things like that. The next reporting period is due in 2020, and 2019 will be the principal reporting year, which we'll explain a little bit more as we go along. The reporting period will begin in June of 2020 and end in October, so you have a limited window. It hasn't started yet. You can't report even if you wanted to, but now's the time to start gathering that information for what's coming. Well, what is coming is going to be really interesting. So who's going to have to report this information first of all? Well, if you're manufacturing a substance and that substance is on the TSCA inventory, or you import that substance and it's on the TSCA inventory, you're going to have to report it. Now, there's a number of exceptions that will allow you to maybe not have to do that, but that's the first line of screening is, did you manufacture a pure substance in your processes, or did you process it? Processors may be wrapped into this yet. We haven't seen the final rule yet. So you're required to report under the CDR if you manufacture more than 25,000 pounds of that substance. 25,000 pounds is not a lot of material in commerce. For some materials, it may be a large amount, but there are a number of cases that you need to be aware of because of what happened in TSCA in the last 2 years that reduced that reporting threshold to 2,500 pounds. So what reduces that threshold? Well, if TSCA, your new substance that you've manufactured, has a Section 5 regulation, basically what we call a SNR, there's 5A, 5B, 5E orders, orders, or a test rule, or one of the Section 7 civil actions where your substance has exceptional harm to people and environment. Basically, if you're one of those substances, you're going to have to report under 2,500 pounds. Well, remember my first presentation where I said EPA is now adding that information into your SDSs. So EPA is dictating, in some cases, what PPE protective equipment or such needs to be used for a particular chemical. If that rolls into an actual SNR, which most of them are, 80% of chemicals now going through TSCA are coming out with some sort of restriction, you now fall into these categories. So the amount of chemicals who are going to trigger that lower threshold for the last 2 years has jumped exponentially. Now, there's a number of exemptions. Hopefully, companies will look to take advantage of these. Some of these are actually provided in the new regulation as well, under what we call the Lautenberg Act. We redefined what a small business is. The original rule that said $4 million or less was a small business. Under Lautenberg, we worked with the Small Business Administration, and they worked with the EPA to define the small businesses as less than 93 million. So if you have a company whose total U.S. sales are less than 93 million, you are exempt from CDR reporting unless you have an explicit restriction like we talked about in the first case, the 5A, 5B rules. Many polymers are exempt. Some people register their polymers with the EPA, so they're on the TSCA inventory. Some are exempt and confidential, so those don't apply. But if you're registered, make sure you check the inventory. Make sure you updated the inventory for your materials. If it has an XU designation, that material is going to be exempt as well. The exemption doesn't apply if you take a polymer and depolymerize it or do any sort of modifications to it. Now you've created a new substance. Also, a lot of biologicals we're used to seeing, enzymes, polysaccharides, proteins are going to be exempt. I thought it was interesting that rubbers are going to be exempt as well. So there's a lot of rubber products that are brought in. It's considered a biological product and exempt. So I talked a little bit about things are going to change this coming year. What's changing? Well, because of the Lautenberg rule and its effects on TSCA, the EPA has had to go through and basically rewrite what the CDR rule is going to look at. They're in the process of doing that. 2018, the rule docket is 2018-3221, excuse me. EPA is proposing amendments to the chemical data reporting rule, which are going to supposedly, in their words, from their website, better support the agency to data collection, update definitions of small entities, add exemptions for specific types of brine products, align reporting with amended TSCA by requiring that all confidentiality claims be substantiated. We'll get into that one a little bit more. And make chemical reporting easier by streamlining complex submissions. 2016 increased the complexity by a factor of 10 for most reporters. This is going to probably be similar in that sort of vein. Actually reading the rule, you can see that it really doesn't make anything simpler for anybody. One of the largest changes is the confidentiality claims. Under the Lautenberg rule, we redefined how you claim confidential information. Previously, substances could be claimed as confidential, their test data and whatnot could be kept confidential and not released to the public, kept on a private inventory. Now Lautenberg says all confidentiality claims must come with substantiation, which means you have to go back and prove that you need to keep it confidential. And if anyone's kept up with the most recent updates to confidentiality, I think this week, they actually came out and said part of the original law that Congress passed, EPA did not fully enact. So the Environmental Defense Fund sued them and said, you didn't do this correctly, you didn't include the concept of reverse engineering into your definition of confidentiality. So now EPA is changing the confidentiality substantiation requirements to include that you have to prove that your product cannot be easily reverse engineered. We're not sure exactly what easily reverse engineered means, but that, for the very basic definition, somebody can't take your product and put it on HPLC, HEC, mass spec, and easily tell what it is. Well, that covers a lot of products, especially if we're talking at things at the substance level. Furthermore, Furthermore, they're going to actually do some more revisions, replacing certain processing and use codes. So if you did the CDR in 2016, you'll note there was a number of use codes for either industrial or commercial use or consumer use. They decided they wanted to use a completely different system and go with the OECD method for uses and product definitions. Well, there's more codes in the OECD system than there are in the EPA system, so obviously some of the EPA codes that we used previously are going to split into multiple codes. That's going to add complexity. What are those proper codes going to be? They actually are talking about waste stream, recycling, and what are exempt in those particular cases. They actually have some new conditions for importers. There's going to be a requirement to identify the percent of the material in a product. Secondary submitters of a joint submission must report the specific chemical function and the percent of chemical in the imported product. So if you're importing material and it's a new material to the United States, and you did the submission to the EPA, you're the secondary submitter, now you have to know the percent of the composition in there. If your importer is not providing it to you, this gets back to one of those cases like Casey was just talking about. Data becomes king. What do you have? What do you know about your products? Do the CDR reporting, and you have a very limited time window now to gather that information. They're going to add a public contact, the Form U. Form U is actually what the form is that EPA calls that you have to fill out to submit to them. And they're modifying the definition of a parent company to clarify the definitions and requirements to report a foreign parent company. So if your parent company is a foreign company, now we're going to have more rules, more information is going to be needed to be gathered to do the CDR reporting. They're supposedly simplifying the reporting process by doing this within an eCDR web reporting tool. I'll cover that a little bit more in a minute, but basically it's EPA's electronic reporting tool. If you're not familiar with CDX, eCDR web will not be simplifying for you. It requires you to start ahead, get a registration, get verified by the government that you're allowed to even be allowed into that system. And also we're going to allow reporting of specific metal categories for inorganic byproducts, clarifying regulatory tax, and adding exemptions for byproducts that are recycled. Now, the interesting part is this is what they're just proposing. We don't even know what the final rule is yet, and we're coming up on the date. We know from what happened in 2016 that you need to provide all reasonably ascertainable information based on your position, not on what you actually have, but whether or not you in that position should have access to that information. From 2016, we knew we had to provide chemical mixture identity, categories of use, quantity, manufactured or processed, byproduct description, health and environmental effects, that section 7 sort of stuff we were talking about, where if somebody reported your chemicals causing harm, somebody reported number of individuals exposed, how many people in the supply chain know how many individuals are exposed to a chemical that they're selling. How far does that go? That's, again, getting back to that data collection that Casey was talking about, and methods of disposal. So in the last CDR period, we knew in 2012, they basically broke it out into one principal year where you needed a lot of information, and all the rest of them were simplified years. So in the simplified year, 2012, 2014, only the name and volume of the chemical was required. However, for 2015, you had to provide all this additional. This is all the 2016 summaries. So chemical identification, information for the manufacturing, as well as consumer and commercial uses for each chemical substance that was given threshold. So each substance has its own threshold. Now they're going to collect all of this, as I said, through eCDR web, which is in CDX system. It will be a program service. They're proposing that by February or March, they're going to have a webinar. So that means hopefully we'll have a rule by January. That's kind of really the drop dead date that we're looking at. However, it's no guarantee with the EPA. And they're saying possible industry trials at that point too. So there's going to be a very limited number of industry trials, but they said that's what it's looking for. So takeaway for the 2020 CDR is, it opens June 1st, closes October 1st. There's going to be a webinar in February, so hopefully we'll have a final rule before then. 2019 will be your principal reporting year, so start gathering your information on production and uses, production volume and uses now. Be alert for the new changes that are coming in the new form, so you have information. You have your materials have section 4 or 5 determinations, so any SNRs or SNUNs or test rules, you'll need to know that prior to going into this. Start looking up those OECD use codes from your supply companies and any additional requirements for imports that we're going to need. So it changes the scope. It's still going to be a lot of work for everybody to import this information into the CDR, but we're all trying to get ready. So hopefully this will go smoothly. But if you have questions, you can always call us. Thanks.
All right. We're just going to get set up for the Q&A panel really quickly. But while we do that, just wanted to make a couple quick announcements. So PACE will be hosting a offering registry exam. So if you or anyone on your team are interested in sitting for the exam, you're welcome to join us. Basically what this involves is study sessions starting in January, and the exam is hosted here in April. You'll find a flyer on the table in the hallway. It describes the dates, information, the certification of the exam, as well as the fees associated. In addition to that, if you would like to learn more about us at all, you can also find literature on the table in the hallway as well. All right, maybe just Steve Dennis.
All right. Give you guys, gentlemen, this. Aren't you sure? Okay. Can you hear me as well?
That's okay. All right, would anybody like to start us off with questions? Oh, online.
Yeah. Well, I have one. What set of materials?
What set of materials are they looking at adding to the ROS board, you know?
Okay, so I wrote them down, I don't have them off the top of my head, but I did have just in case of more information.
So the 7 are diethylene trioxide, TBBPA, which is tetra, bromobisphenol, idiom phosphide, MCCP for medium chain chlorinated paraffins, beryllium compounds, nickel sulfate and nickel sulfonate, and cobalt dichloride and cobalt sulfate.
Steve, regarding aerosols and the adoption of category 3, would you anticipate basically your software would spit out something such as category 3 non-flammable aerosol and still gases under pressure? Is that what you anticipate them looking like?
Sure.
Well, we're anticipating under revision 7 that will completely go over to just its own aerosol classification as non-hazardous aerosols. That's what has happened with updates to the GHS now. So that's why it's kind of a major, almost a classification, almost production level change, because you're classifying now as a compressed gas, which is normally people are looking at it as cylinders and such. But that's the only thing that they had at the time that was close. Now they're totally breaking them out into this, really as aerosols. And if you read the rule, aerosols have a very specific definition involving nozzles and things like that. So it does make more sense. It was always kind of a problem for the U.S., especially if we manufactured an aerosol in the United States and shipped to, say, Canada, who has revision 5, different definitions, different classifications now have to ship. So it'll be a big improvement, I think, for unifying things. But yes, the software hopefully that everybody has will update, but you have to stay up with those updates. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything regarding CDR reporting? All right.
I have a lot of questions about CDR.
Should we let them? All right. Well, we won't make you sit here then, but if you do have questions for Steve Dennis or Casey, you're welcome to, they'll be here for 20 minutes or so networking, so you're welcome to approach them with any questions you may have if you want to. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you coming out. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.